glad to be back in Manchester. The last time I was in Manchester, I was a fellow, I don't like the word very much, at the Department of History, not economics, the department. This was a long time ago. This was before Deirdre, so it was a quarter of a century ago. But, you know, as a free market economist, I have a warm place in my heart for Manchester and Free Trade Hall and all that. I advise you to use speaker view, not gallery view, because I have some things I'm going to show you, and you won't be able to see them on the small screen. I would. Someone's talking. Someone's talking. Yeah.
Would you please all mute yourselves if you're not muted already? Thanks.
Yeah, it's simply for background noise, not to stop you in your life. So, speaker view is smart. I certainly welcome emails from any of you on this important matter of what I regard as an elementary point, but an elementary point that's systematically missed in the in econometrics, and I think has more or less wrecked the field. It's a shame because I was, for a person of my PhD generation, which, you know, is a long time ago, I'm quite well trained in econometrics, and you know, I had Guy Orcutt was a teacher of mine, and Hendrik Houtacker and lots of others, and I had great faith in econometrics, and indeed as a way of thinking, rather like abstract general equilibrium modeling or theorems, it's still valuable to me. I'm working now on a book on English open fields and enclosures, medieval and early modern economic history. And this is going to be a long book, I'm afraid, but it's very, very quantitative. And right from the beginning, I'm measuring how many plots a single peasant had, and you know, plots of land, and so on and so forth. And I'm constantly asking the question, which I learned from engineers actually, how big in all other scientific fields, geology, even history, but certainly engineering and physics and so forth, they're always asking how much. And they're never asking the question of existence. That particular idea, does something exist for every epsilon greater than 0? There exists a delta such that blah, blah, blah. That's a mathematics department interest. It's not anything that any engineer needs for her work. So I'm a quantitative person. This is not a statement against numbers. I think numbers are important. Today in Chicago, the temperature along the lake is 60 degrees Fahrenheit, a very interesting and important number. So I'm not against numbers. I think a lot of historical and economic questions turn on quantities. By the way, I won't go into that. So numbers matter. But what also matters is categories, qualitative categories. Look, if you're going to measure the population of Manchester, you've got to have an initial definition of what Manchester is. Does it include Salford and so forth? Is it Greater Manchester, or is it Manchester as defined by some other way? And you have to know what people are. You have to know what you mean by a person if you're going to count the number of people. So it's obvious that for any scientific purpose, say an astronomer studying red giants, she needs to know qualitatively what a red giant is. And that's crucial. It's true. Every scientific inquiry starts in the humanities, in philosophy, in human interests. This is a point that the great Danish physicist Niels Bohr made. He said once, "Physics is not about the world." What? That's a shocking thing for a physicist to say. And then he explained, physics is about what humans want to know about the world. And that's true of us in economics too. We're there are a zillion, infinite number of things you can say about the economic world. How many redheaded could you please turn the person in the Mickey Mouse hat is making trouble. Yeah, that's good. You can let's see, I lost my train. What we're interested in the economy is at our choice. It's not arbitrary. It's something that you and I can discuss in intelligent ways. When you're measuring national income, for example, what is included in national income? Is what's included in, does it include, as I think it should, the value of housework, or should it not? And that's something we discuss qualitatively. A number doesn't solve that question. But then we go on to measuring national income, and then we have something to say about questions that interest us as humans. So the same thing is true of econometric estimates. Say, but by the way, let me start now. Make sure you have the speaker view, or else this is going to be hard to see. Let me put on. Whoops. Let me put on my own. Well, it doesn't matter. Here's my email. Can you see that? Can you see my email? Shake your head if you can. Say yes. Yes. Okay. So that's my email and my website, which is just DeirdreMcCloskey.org. If you Google my name and you spell Deirdre correctly, it's Irish spelling, so watch out. This will come up. My website will come up, and there are lots of papers on this matter of statistical significance that I've written by myself, and then a lot of papers in collaboration with Steve Ziliak. And you can see from this selection from that bibliography that I've been writing on this subject since when? 1985. You can think of me as clinging to the knees of economists and saying, guys, you're making a big mistake here. Here it is. There's 1985, and then there's the paper in 1996 that Steve Ziliak and I did, and here's another one, and then there's the book, which if you have any doubts about what I'm saying this afternoon, challenge yourself. Read the book. There it is. And if you're cheap and you don't want to buy the book, I hope you do, because it'll help me I'll get some of the royalties. But if you don't, you can go to my website and get all these papers that Steve and I have written over the years. And if after that you're not persuaded, after reading the book or reading a bunch of the papers, then you're not only hard to persuade, you're committing a type 2 or no, a type 1 error of a quite significant sort intellectually. Now, let me state the point somewhat abstractly. Here it is. Numbers do not contain their own interpretation. If I say to you, in Chicago, the weather today is 4.8, you'll say to me, what do you mean 4.8? On a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100? What does that mean? And then if I'm convinced that statistical significance is a good way to go, I'll say, what? Don't you believe in numbers? What are you, a anti-quantitative humanist, some sort of person from the English department? Come on, it's a number, 4.8. And that's the basic problem. Numbers don't contain their own interpretation, neither do words, for that matter. We interpret them in a community. And as Niels Bohr said, it depends on what our interests are. Now, 4 years ago, or is it 5, the American Statistical Association, which you'll have to agree is, a fairly serious bunch of folks, they made the same point that I just made. Here it is. Here's the citation. Can you see that? I hope you can. It was a committee of the American Statistical Association which decided that the mechanical use, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, the mechanical use of tests of statistical significance, R squares, chi-squares are the same way, fit is the same problem, is not by itself sufficient for making statistical decisions correctly. Back in the 1930s, Neyman and Pearson, in a famous paper, outlined a decision-theoretic way of deciding numbers, not deciding numbers, deciding issues. And they pointed out, I think it was 1936, they pointed out right at the beginning of statistical decision theory that you can't decide a question with the numbers alone. They gave the example of executions for murder, which at the time were happening in Britain. And they said, look, yeah, okay, you've got a certain probability that this person committed the murder. You may be very confident. But then there are figures in deciding whether to execute him. If he's a hacker, I hope you go ahead and do it. There is the problem of the social attitudes towards making a type 2 error, right? Are you going to sometimes, what probability of executing an innocent person does the society accept? And indeed, what's the attitude of the society towards execution regardless of the probabilities? My own attitude is that for the state to be given the dignity of being able to execute people as a 19th century Manchester style liberal, I'm against the state having that sort of power. So, and that's right. Neyman and Pearson got it right. And since then, people have fallen under the charms of a contemporary of Neyman and Pearson, namely R.A. Isher, who proposed the rule of two. If something is two standard deviations, it might as well be zero. Two standard deviations away, it might as well be zero. That was he hated the idea that in a way, his student, but student T, you'll see in the tables, it's called student T. That was a man named Gossett, who worked for charmingly worked all his life. He was a chemist from Oxford, I think. He worked all his life for the Guinness Brewing Company, and then towards the end of his life for the London office of that company as a chemist. And he proposed, or he invented, the T distribution for small samples. And Gossett, all his career, gently quarreled with R.A. Fisher about this arbitrary level of two. He said, no, hold on. We have a sample size of 4 of various fields of barley by various different farmers in Ireland, and to make our beer, and it costs us if we screw up. So what's going on here is exactly what Neyman and Pearson suggested, that you need a loss function. You need to know how much it matters if you under or overestimate, say, the slope of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment in terms of economic policy, or any of the other things we're trying to estimate econometrically. A long time ago, I did with a colleague a couple of papers on the gold standard, the classical gold standard, and the issue is, I won't go into the details, but there were lots of tests at the time, I think they're still going on, tests of purchasing power parity between price levels. And people were using tests of statistical significance to decide whether, say, the UK's price level is linked to that of France's. And that's silly, because the number doesn't tell you by itself. You need to know how far a failure of arbitrage between France and Britain is before you can decide whether it's significant or not. Important, not statistically significant. So, I mean, I've tried all kinds of ways of making this point. I can give you a couple of others, maybe. And this notion of the loss function is very important. Suppose you're an astronomer cataloging the Earth intersecting orbits of large asteroids. Now, this is something you want to know, I want to know, everyone wants to know, because now, for the last half century or so, we've been able to do something about an Earth intersecting orbit of an asteroid. Say it's a mile wide. If it hits the Earth, it will exterminate all life on Earth. And that can happen. In fact, it's going to happen sometime. Now, for the last half century or so, we've been able to send up rockets, and we get better and better at it. And we could, I don't know, send 100 astronauts to this asteroid, this big asteroid, land on it, and on the count of 3, all the asteroids would jump. And that would cause the asteroid to move a little bit, and it would miss the Earth by 100,000 miles. So you're the astronomer tasked with collecting the data on this. And you notice that there's an asteroid out there. Again, let's say it's a mile wide, and its probability of hitting the Earth, according to the accuracy you can measure or guess at of your observations, it's got a probability of 5% of hitting the Earth. But according to R.A. Fisher, 5% is not significant. Suppose it's 6% to make it simple. 6% is not significant at the 5% level of significance. So you don't tell anyone about it. You're subjecting all life on Earth to a 1 in 20 chance of complete extermination. But because the numbers are such and such, you don't tell anyone, even though there's something to be done about it. You know, in 1900, I don't want to know if it's going to happen this afternoon, but now I do. So you can see that the loss function matters. It's just the common sense of it all. Here's another way of looking at it. This is from our book in 2008. I don't know if I can get the whole thing on it. I'll go back a bit. Can you see that more or less? Can you see it? Okay. Well, you know, down at the bottom you can see the what's substantively significant, that line of substantive significance. And you can see that if it's not statistically significant, which is the vertical axis, then it doesn't get reported, and the science percents 0. So there's no chance. So see, you can see here the scientific problem we have in econometrics. We did for our book and for the article in 1996, and then again we later we did it, a kind of a survey of all the econometric papers in the American Economic Review from 1985 to 95, and then from 96 to 2006. And we applied to each of the papers, these econometric papers, a sort of a questionnaire. I think there were 19 questions on them. Questions like, does the paper ignore power as against significance? Does it, and various other things. And the standard of use of this tool, not against the tool itself, but I am against its gross misuse, was extremely low. And some of the most famous economists you can name were the ones misusing it. Very few of the papers had the common sense to ask, now here's the big question in science, a quantitative science like ours, how big is big? The number doesn't tell you by itself. Modulo a correct definition or an interesting definition, it does. Or modulo a loss function, it does. But without those, a number 12, 348, whatever it is, doesn't contain its own interpretation. Here's a concrete example from a great epidemiologist and quantitative biologist, Kenneth, what's his name, Rockman or whatever his name is. Here it is. Here's a distribution. You'll notice this orange thing over in the corner. That's the probability that a and I'm kind of vague on the details of this study, but this again is from our book, and I haven't gone back and checked the exact definitions. But it's essentially about, should women, as men are recommended to, take a baby aspirin a day to prevent heart attacks? And is that what it's about? Yeah, I think so. And that over there is those is those who will die if they don't. Now, considering the very low cost in every way you can name of taking a baby aspirin, that's 80 milligrams, 82, I think, a day, it's pretty obvious that you want everyone to be taking, men, women, old, young, taking this. But these are the people who are going to die because some statistician had said, oh, well, 5%, that's not to be taken into consideration. In economics, the standard way of presenting econometric results originated from the way that results would come out on computer paper in the old days before we had laptop computers. When we had to go down, as I remember so well, to the computing center at Manchester or London or Harvard or wherever, and put in, all the older people here will sympathize, a stack of cards, and then the next morning we'd get the result. And from that, that's how we got the presentation format that you see in every economics journal. And one thing it does is uses little asterisks. One asterisk means significant at the 5% level, 2 means significant at the 0.01 level, 3 means significant at the 0.001 level. And we attach those to the coefficients. There are always standard errors underneath each of the fitted coefficients. And this is a crazy way to do science. This is pazzo. This is insane. It's not the case that insignificant variables, statistics so-called, I'm just going to use R.A. Fisher's phrase, so-called statistically insignificant variables are not important. The example of the Earth intersecting orbit of an asteroid is an instance. Nor is it the case that statistically significant variables are the important ones. Statistical significance. Now hear this. This is the most formal statement of what I'm saying. Statistical significance is neither necessary nor sufficient for economic significance. Let me repeat that. You learn nothing scientifically from statistical significance, unless indeed you have the context, go back to Niels Bohr, of a human question which you've correctly categorized. You know that line of oomph, we call it, of importance. And only when you've got that set up does sampling error give you anything. Now, this argument, this point I'm making is not the only thing that's wrong with the way statistical significance is used in economics. For one thing, it's routinely used on universes of data, not samples. The only legitimate use of tests of significance, you've got all the bells and whistles of loss functions and everything going. The only legitimate use is when you're taking a sample of size 30, say, from a universe It can be an unlimited universe of a finite universe with sampling with replacement, or it can be an intrinsically infinite sized universe. It doesn't matter. You're taking a sample and trying to infer the parameter of the universe. That's all it does. That's what sampling theory is about. But sampling theory is not, or they express it this way: sampling variation is not the only source of error. That's kind of obvious. Your numbers may be crappy in some other way. You've asked the wrong question. Your specification is wrong, blah, blah, blah. There are all kinds of other problems which you learn about in econometrics courses that say, stop it. That's not how to decide. There are worse problems. So, as I say, since 1995, I'll end here. I've been clinging to the knees of the economics profession, trying to get them to understand this. In some other fields, it's understood. You will not find physicists or astronomers using tests of statistical significance this way. If you don't believe me, go to, I don't know, the astronomy library, the physics library, open the empirical volume of the American Physical Review or whatever it's called, and look for tests of statistical significance. You won't find them. The way a physicist or a geologist or any kind of quantitative scientist uses numbers, say in an experiment or observation, is to look at the numbers, say on a chart, and notice, and she has some theoretical prediction, say parabola, and she notices that at the top of the parabola, the observations don't come very close. That's all judgment she's making to the theoretical parabola. She says, "Oh, there's something wrong here." And that's all they do. They do not do tests of statistical significance of the fit of a parabola to the data. They just don't do it. They use common sense. They answer the question, how big is big? It's not arbitrary. As I said, it's something that we as economists can talk about and make progress about and say, look, for example, let's take the case of the efficacy of the minimum wage. We're trying in the United States to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. I'm against it. You might as well know. But in any case, there have been many, many empirical studies. And then we can argue about what's big and what's small. The one thing that's big or that's important, whether statistically significant or not, is that some people, say young people, unskilled young people, are certainly going to be driven out of employment by increasing the minimum wage. In South Africa, where I've taught, this is a real plague. So, economic science is about quantitative judgment, and statistical significance is nothing like a substitute or a necessary component even of quantitative judgment. And that's what I have to say. I can't hear you for some reason. Why is that?
So I've been allowed to be unmuted now, which
yes.
reminds me to mention that I sincerely send my apologies for the disruption we had. Obviously, we're not immune from the trolls and nasty people on the internet. So
I guess
I'm
so.
sorry. I'm sorry, Deirdre, and to the audience if any of you were offended. But thank you so much for given us such a lovely talk, and it was those people's loss because they got kicked out. So onto the questions. If you would like to raise your hand if you have one, and I'll hopefully get round to you all, and just be patient. I will get to you. So Bandile, if you would like to ask your question first, hopefully you can be unmuted. Go ahead.
Are you unmuted? Yeah, hi.
Hi. Thank you very much, Deirdre, for your presentation, and to Finn and your team. Thanks. Your troubles have been worth it. This was really, really, really great. So don't worry. Deirdre, I've just got a question. I think your very last comments on like the minimum wage that you mentioned
Sure.
Raised the question to me. I'm from South Africa as well, and I actually worked at a place called the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative in my first job. And the question I'm getting at is that, you know, in many parts of the world, we kind of have a lot of polarization and contestation on economic policy. And so people are really, with all these like competing views and everyone, you know, kind of being quote unquote entitled to their own facts. Sort of thing. The question is that people will look to statistics and data as the arbiter of these questions, of these highly polarized political questions. So the question is something like, what is the role of, what should economists or econometricians be doing better in order to, you know, kind of restore their faith in numbers, sort of thing?
Well, here's the danger. Here's the danger. If we use a defective instrument, such as mechanical tests of statistical significance, to decide, and this, by the way, that was exactly R.A. Fisher's line. He said, oh no, I don't want it to be subjective. I want it to be objective. And everyone said, oh, great. Now we've got an objective way of telling whether the minimum wage in South Africa has a significant effect on blacks and colored, for that matter. And the trouble is, if we use a defective instrument because we think that at least will settle the matter, we're going to get caught out, to speak in cricket terms. You know, there's a slip fielder there waiting for that ball. And if he's, you know, I'm a big cricket fan, so it's dangerous. I completely understand the point, and I understand the desire for objectivity. But I think we do better if we get beyond, not beyond objectivity, but we get serious about the ethical problems with following the policy that the Congress of South African Trade Unions wants, which is a high minimum wage to protect its members from low-wage Zulus. That's what it amounts to. And we got to say, oh no, I'm not, you know, there's an issue here, but okay. So, you know, I think ethical, substantive, scientific candor is the best road. Now, I know, I sympathize with the problem, and I'd be very interested if you would email me and tell me more about this this commission that you were on. Ik hou van South Africa. I love South Africa. Not so good these days in cricket, alas. Who's next? Hello. Are you unmute yourself? There you go.
Hello. Yeah, so my question was kind of just like all of the stuff that you've been saying about the skepticism of significance of any results and the importance of understanding it in a context. Throughout all my education of statistics, even from when I was in high school, like 5 years ago, it's always seemed to have been taught with that sort of context in mind, and especially my econometrics at university, which I only started learning last year. These things, it was always seemed to be quite embedded in everything that we were doing. And it was like, we've got to be aware of the context. But I'm not sure if this is just my individual experience as an undergraduate at Manchester, but from what you see now, do you think that the next generation of people working in economics and the undergraduates of economics will still be part of this cult of significance where they're obsessed with statistical values arbitrarily of the context in which they're used?
It's not really about context. I understand what you're saying, and it's admirable that you've been taught since secondary school to be kind of serious about the numbers and say, no, look, numbers by themselves aren't dispositive, as we say in law. Okay, and that's sensible. Come to think of it, I was taught this way too, more than half a century ago. But the technical point remains. As long as people publish papers with asterisks and allow themselves to follow, well, here's one thing. Every time series program that you might use has inside it tests of statistical significance for adding and dropping variables. That is wrong. So the results, sometimes of great policy significance in another sense, like the minimum wage in South Africa, are being decided incorrectly. And by the way, that sampling thing I pointed out at the end is true of time series in a big way. Because often people say, well, the quarterly national incomes figures in the UK since the war are a sample size of 4 times how many years it's been. No, they're not. They're a sample size of 1. Which doesn't allow much tests for statistical significance. They're one instantiation of an infinite number of possible histories drawn from the universe of all possible histories of UK national income since the war. So the answer is no.
Thanks a lot for the question. Rob, you're up next, my Econometrics lecturer.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. Yeah, so I guess my question follows on from Zach's question, and I've been responsible for some of his econometrics education. So some of the things you were saying, I felt a little, self-conscious about the way I teach these things as well. So I guess my question is in 2 parts, and if one follows on from Zach's, which is, in essence, what is it going to take for the economics profession to sort of break its reliance on statistical significance? I think you characterize yourself as clinging to the knees of economists. And I guess the second thing is, how much of it do you think, in terms of teaching, I know particularly for myself, it's a lot easier to teach somebody the mechanical process of doing a statistical significance test rather than teaching the process that you talked about, which isn't necessarily a reason not to do it, but do you think that drives part of it? It's easier to identify statistical significance than it is economic.
Well, I think that you're on both counts. You're correct, or you're coming at it the right way. On the matter of how to teach this stuff, one way to do it is to stop using toy examples for teaching econometrics. Use real examples with real policy importance. And then people will see, then their passions are brought in, and let's do, say, tests of the effect of the minimum wage on unemployment or something like that. Then they'll see how important the loss function is. They'll see how important it is to actually, context is too vague a word. What it costs you if you screw up. And then, so far as the first is concerned, well, I've been giving this talk forever. Around 2000, I gave it to a big audience at the American Economic Association meetings in Chicago. I got Kenneth Arrow to agree with me, for example. And, it was amazing to watch because on the aisle, who's the guy at Oxford, the econometrician who says test? What's his name? I have a hard time remembering his name for some reason. He's an older guy. He's about my age. He says test. What?
Not David Hendry, was it?
Yeah, it was David Hendry. He was on the aisle, and I could see his face getting redder and redder as we talked. He says, use tests of statistical significance all over the place to test the distribution of chi-square to test. So I don't know quite what to do. If you have any suggestions, please send me an email urgently, and you and I can work on improving this. It's crucial that the teachers of econometrics teach people to respect numbers and to take them seriously, and then really take them seriously. I remember when I was studying econometrics, when I learned about the problem of errors in variables, errors in the independent variable, I was sort of startled. As a beginning economic historian, I knew that data isn't all it's cracked up to be. And I said, oh, no, it's biased towards zero. Gee, that's interesting. And that kind of thing ought to be emphasized.
Thanks a lot, Rob, for the question. I don't see any more hands. Does anyone else have a question to ask, Deirdre?
I've persuaded you all. You're all converts.
You've got one, Deirdre.
Okay, let's hear it.
You've got a couple, actually. So
good, glad to hear that.
Let's go. Go ahead, Sam.
I just wondered if, is there anything any big results or not laws of economics that this sort of recontextualizing of data not disproves, but maybe sort of makes them seem a bit shakier or anything like that? Does it recontextualize any of it? That's
a very, very good question. And Steve and I haven't done that enough. We have some criticisms of the classic Card and Kruger book and paper on the effects of the minimum wage, where they said, oh, it's not very important. But we haven't done enough of that. And here's something for a young econometrically oriented economist to do, is to do precisely that. Now, there is a bit of a problem here, which is this. This is going to be a shocking statement, so I hope not to offend everyone. I don't mind offending some people, but not everyone. There is no important scientific conclusion in economics since the invention of econometrics that has depended on econometrics. Econometrics has had essentially no results. It's produced a lot of published papers, I don't deny that, but it hasn't told us anything important about the economy. New sources of information have. You know, I, as an economic historian, I work with, you know, our long series, our long understanding of national income per head in real terms, and sort of intellectual turning points like rational expectations. It didn't stay turned, but it turned. And in macroeconomics have been important. But I assert that it's very hard to find any important policy conclusion or any important scientific conclusion that is dependent on an econometric coefficient. But you can go around finding people claiming this, claiming there is. Look at my finding. Okay, take their finding. It's not, as I said, this word context is much too vague. Do the econometrics over again, not say dropping variables that are insignificant if you have a good reason on other economic grounds to believe they belong in the equation, say, and see what happens. And that would be a brilliant paper. If you do that for 3 or 4 allegedly important results from econometrics, you're going to become famous.
Well, thanks a lot, Sam, for that great question and for the answer. I like the idea of not doing any more econometrics. No.
Look,
I'm only joking. I'm only joking, Rob. I'm only joking.
But this is not the easy way out. I'm not saying, look, fitting hyperplanes to 3-dimensional or n-dimensional scatters of points there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good, it's not, one of the big problems is we have 3 terms of econometrics in graduate programs. There shouldn't be 3 terms. There should be 1 term of econometrics. Then we should be learning all kinds of other quantitative methods, simulation especially. Because the way quantitative science works in other sciences is predominantly through simulation.
Oh, thanks. So we have one more question from Nina. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Nina.
Hello, how are you?
Glad to have a female voice. The guys always ask the first questions.
Yeah, my bad. I wanted to see what everyone else had to say, if I'm honest. And it kind of does follow on from what a few people have been talking about. And I'm fully aware that quite a few people in this group are currently undertaking our first research as undergrads, as our first independent research for our dissertations. And I was thinking, what would you recommend including, or not necessarily including, but how would you recommend we go about kind of including this kind of new stance on econometrics and kind of taking into account everything that you said, and also ensuring that we abide by the econometric laws that we have been given?
Here's how you do it. Here's how you do it. Now, this is, I'm only saying this to you, dear. I don't want the others to hear. So they should close their ears. Lie. Tell a falsehood. Do all the statistical tests. Present your tables with asterisks all over them. But make your real scientific decisions on the basis of substantive importance. Now, I've seen, that's actually, I'm told, people say, oh, Deirdre, you've had a great influence. I don't believe I have, but they say so. You know, they're being nice. And they say, oh, notice that people now talk about substantive significance. Before they just gave the statistical significance and then carried on with whatever argument they were making. And that's how to do it. Because some idiot, I shouldn't be so harsh, because some emotionally and intellectually challenged person will object if you don't do the econometric bells and whistles. Do them. Learn them, do them, but ignore them. Do the science. Don't do the phony what's it called? Cargo cult science. Don't do the phony stuff. I mean, do it, show it, but don't depend on it.
But then, how can you then back yourself up?
They won't notice.
When you make these kind of not necessarily arbitrary but substantive things, how do you back yourself in your
you talk to other economics researchers. You ask, what would they think is big? This is what physicists do. This is what engineers do. How big is big? And you talk about it. And you say, well, that's look. Here's another way of encapsulating what I'm saying. Watch the slope.
Okay.
The way the hyperplane, the slope of a hyperplane is important. Its fit is not.
I see.
Look, if you wear I won't go into that. There's a kind of way of doing this with. No, I'm not going to do it. That is not the same. That something fits well is not the same thing as importance.
I see. Thank you very much. Yeah.
You're welcome, dear.
I'll take that on board.
Lie.
So, Deirdre, I'm aware of the time. How are we doing for it? Can we fit a few more questions in?
You can go on all day with this. I'm talking to the people I want to talk to, who are young. They're young economists. I'm afraid people my age. I was born in 1942, so don't do the math. They're not going to change their minds. They're going to be like the guy at Oxford who goes test, test, test.
In that case, Pal, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip the queue. I'll come to you next. I'm going to ask a quick question, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
In light of this idea that we're incapable of handling uncertainty or the errors or understanding where things go, would it be better to base economic judgments or decisions on moral arguments, maybe? So take, for example, I don't know the situation in South Africa, but look, we don't know whether unemployment is going to go up or down. Some places it doesn't change, some places it goes up, whatever. But in fact, morally, let's give these people more money than just enough to live off substance.
Yeah,
would approaching economic decisions in that way be a good idea?
Not exclusively, because that's why so many economists on the left are in favor of the minimum wage. Because they think, for God's sakes, $15 an hour, you can barely make it. On $7 an hour, that's hopeless. So you got to raise this. Gosh, that's to come from your heart. And I'm not against making important social decisions from the heart. God knows. But if it's only from the heart and you're just ignoring the young, unskilled people, as in South Africa, who get no employment, you're just sort of forgetting about them. That's not even a very good heart. So, look, I'm the last person in the world to say that serious ethical thinking doesn't belong in economics. I think once I thought that we want, positive normative, and we'll just be positive scientists and all that. We won't mess with this ethics. That's something I once believed when I was your age. Now I don't anymore. And I've written whole books saying that. In fact, I've got a book coming out this spring they've got another one coming out this fall from the University of Chicago Press, which is, they're both of these books from the University of Chicago Press make a big deal of getting ethics, serious ethics, not just this toy utilitarianism that people deal with, but serious ethics into economics. But we got to have the numbers too. And I don't want you to infer from this talk that I'm against quantification. I'm a quantitative lady. I believe in numbers. I just don't think, I think it's kind of childish to only believe in numbers.
Well, thank you, Deirdre. And don't worry, I won't hide away from numbers completely.
Good.
And rest easy, Rob, as well. Next, Pal, if you would like to ask a question, go ahead. If you can.
Yeah, thanks a lot thanks for the talk. And sorry if my question is a bit repetitive, if I missed something.
Sure.
And I think you half answered it right now, but I'm still going to ask, do you think economists should learn qualitative methods a lot like other social sciences do?
Yes. Yes, very much so. That's what I mean. If I was in charge of designing a graduate program, absolutely. I would have one term of very hard, very serious econometrics, where you really get into it. You do instrumental all the way through instrumental variables, you do all this stuff. One term though. And then I would have two other terms on what you're calling, well, they aren't all qualitative, but other methods. For example, here's a kind of antique example that'll make the point. National income accounting. How many of you know the difference between GNP and GDP? Well, thank you. Is that an older member of the audience? Because we were once trained in this kind of stuff. How many of you know enterprise accountancy? Well, I wasn't trained in that. I didn't ever take a course in accountancy. I should have. How many of you even know how the unemployment figures are constructed? Did you know they come from a survey? How many of you have had training in designing survey questions? How many of you, it goes on and on. How many of you have any archival experience, such as historians do? How many of you, now here's one that's very interesting. How many of you have serious graphical knowledge? I mean, that you know how to make graphs, very complicated graphs, 3-4-dimensional graphs for, you have to imagine it, but anyway. And here's a concrete question along those lines. How many of you have read Tufte? His name is Tufte. A book called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. One of the great books of the second half of the 20th century. If you haven't read that, you're quantitatively crippled. So that's my speech on the quantitative and qualitative curriculum. We should also look, we're the economic molecules. So we should also have knowledge of so to speak, epistemology, how you use insights from your own experience to do economic science.
Brilliant, thanks. And just for the audience, I'll make sure all these recommendations are collated and we post them on our social media pages. So, and then, so just one last question from Zach. We've got time.
Thank you. Like you've been saying about the curriculum, and earlier you mentioned about the importance of maybe adopting some of the approaches other sciences have, such as using simulations. I read a paper quite interestingly that was using an AI model to try and estimate the impacts of some arbitrary tax policy on a little community economy of individual actors, and it got some interesting results. But what do you think are the key things to bear in mind ethically when we're using these simulations? Because obviously the consequences of using simulations on to model how people behave, and then judging decisions off that, maybe even greater than you know, somewhere like physics, where your actors are microscopic particles or something.
Well, that's where the ethics comes in, obviously. The most sharp example of what you're saying are field experiments. Field experiments is against experiments and a bunch of undergraduates who have volunteered for the experiment, such as Bart Wilson and Vernon Smith do. I have no objection to that, and you get very interesting results because they're not experimenting psychologically. They're not experimenting on one person, essentially, which is what this is. An unfortunate tendency in behavioral economics is to redo psychology. And we don't have to redo psychology. We're social scientists. So the kinds of experiments, classroom experiments we should be doing is on, as you said, sort of baby societies. A society of Manchester undergraduates and I don't mean real experiments. I mean questionnaire experiments that aren't going to hurt them. But the trouble with field experiments is that they do hurt people. A spectacular example of this that I've written on, and so has Steve Ziliak, is a shocking experiment that happened in China on school children by some American economists to try to find out if extreme short-sightedness, easily corrected with spectacles, made it harder for school children to learn Chinese characters. Now, in the first place, and very importantly, we already know that if you can't see Chinese characters, you can't learn them. And what these people did, it was hideous. They wouldn't have been able to do it in the United States because it wouldn't have been allowed, at least academically. They took 40,000 Chinese children with extreme short-sightedness and gave half of them spectacles. Now, you tell me what the ethics of that is. Obviously, what they should have done is taken all the money they got from the National Science Foundation or something and spectacles, given it to all. That's what they've done. Yeah, that you experiment. This is against Kant, or this is what Immanuel Kant said. He said, don't use up people involuntarily. So, hey, experiments are good if they're ethically done. AI simulations are good if they make sense. But you know, anything we do is going to have policy consequences. So that's why we have to be so careful. I have a friend named George DiMartino, who did a very good book some years ago called The Economist's Oath. George DiMartino, D-E, then Martino. The Economist's Oath, in which he talked about this problem of harm. As you said, as far as I'm concerned, we can jerk around polymers in chemistry all you want, feel free, but we can't jerk around people.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deirdre, and everyone for your great questions. I'm sure we're all going to view economic statistical significance in a new light. And also, thanks for some great insight just there on ethics of field experiments. So, thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. And goodbye. I'll stick around for a few moments after if anyone wants to ask any questions about the society. But yeah, thanks a lot.
I have a final thing to say that my father used to say in saying goodbye. Be good. If you can't be good, be careful. I have to slightly modify it. If you can't be careful, name her after me.
Brilliant.
It's an old vulgar male joke. I apologize. It's terrible. Okay, dears. Ciao, ciao.
Bye. Thank you.
Cheerio.
Thank you. Bye.
Keep a straight bat and watch out for the googlies.